Welcome, and today we're going to talk about layers and how we create new objects and put them in our scene. Up until now, I've referred to objects as things like our cube, our cone, the camera, the lamp. All of those things are objects. When we talk about shapes specifically, like this cube, we call these things a mesh. So any 3D shape that is built into the scene, we call those meshes, and that distinguishes them from the camera object and the lamp object. So everything in this scene is an object, only the cube is a mesh. So let's start adding some other stuff to this scene. One thing that you should notice are these little crosshairs down here. Now, your crosshairs will only work if you are able to both right and left click. So on a Mac, you may need to set up your right and left click settings to get this to work. However, if you've got the default input in Blender, so using right click to select objects, left click moves around these little crosshairs. The reason these crosshairs are useful is because they represent where the next object or mesh is going to be placed. So whenever I want to create something, it's going to be created on top of these crosshairs. Normally the crosshairs start in the middle, and that's why stuff gets created in the middle. But if I move the crosshairs around, I can create things elsewhere. So let's learn how to add meshes to our scene. There are two ways to do this. The first way, without using shortcuts, is to go over to the tabs on our toolbar, or on our tools window, right? This is our tools window. And there's a little tab below tools that says create. If we click that create tab, we can see that we have a mesh category and then a whole bunch of options of things that we can add to our scene. We can add a plane, a cube, a circle, two different types of spheres, a cylinder, a cone, a torus, which is basically just a donut, a grid, or a monkey. We are going to start by adding a cone to this scene. So I'm going to zoom out so we can see the cone get added. When I click cone, you can see that the center of the cone is placed in the crosshairs. So what I'm going to do for the purpose of illustrating our topic today is just add a bunch of stuff to this scene. I'm going to add a few more cones. Let's add a couple more cubes. Let's add a circle over here and a torus right here. And how about one more sphere? So today's topic is not just about creating objects. Creating objects is the easy part. But before I move on, I would like to show you guys the shortcut for creating meshes. We can either use the Create tab, or we can press Shift A on our keyboard. Think A for add. We're using A to add stuff to our scene. So Shift A brings up this little menu, and I can hover over Mesh and select the mesh that I want to insert. Another torus in here. So Shift A brings up our add menu. Remember that it's still going to add something wherever the crosshairs are. So if I do Shift A over here, just because the menu is here, whatever object I select, so if I add a sphere, it's going to happen in the crosshairs. So we've got a lot of stuff in our scene. And unfortunately, sometimes scenes can become so large that they are hard to deal with. So we want to take stuff in this scene and separate it to make it more manageable. For example, let's say I want to do a lot of work with my cones, but I only want to look at the cones. I don't want to see everything else in my scene right now. I just want to place some cones where they're supposed to be, and then I want to work on everything else. I can achieve this using something called layers. For those of you that have worked with Photoshop or another image editing program before, you may have seen layers, or you may already be familiar with layers. But layers are just a set of canvases, if you will, that hold different parts of our final product. And then when our final product is finished, all of the layers get smushed together to create the final scene. So I'm going to stick with my cone example. Let's say that I want to edit these cones, but I want to edit them without seeing all of this other stuff. I can move cones to new layers. To do that, the first thing we need to understand is which layer we are on currently. The current layer is our layer that is selected in these little chiclets down here. I like to call them chiclets, but they're these tiny little squares at the bottom of the screen. Each of these squares represents a layer in Blender, and you can see that there are 20 of them. So we have more layers here than we probably will need in this class, but it gives you a lot of layers to be able to divide up the stuff that you want to deal with. Now, most often, when we're dealing with layers, a lot of times layers will represent the background, the foreground, maybe we'll have a separate layer for the camera and the lamp, but we're not worried about like giving every object its own layer. However, we are going to do something like that. Oh, my Java is ready to be updated. We are going to do something like that today. Today we're going to take the cubes and we're going to put them on, the cones, and we're going to put the cones on their own layer. Now, if I select a different layer in the little layer squares down here, let's say I select the second one, you'll notice that everything in my scene disappears. Everything is actually still there. However, on this visible layer, there are no objects. So when I'm working in this layer, I can't see anything. So what I want to do is I want to move all of the things on the first layer, or all of the cones on the first layer, and I want to move them to the second layer. I'm going to go back to the first layer. You can see that I changed my visible layer by selecting one of the squares down here. I'm going to have my cone selected, and we're going to learn a new shortcut today. This shortcut is M. M as in mom. We're going to use M to move an object to another layer. So think of M for move. With the cone selected, I'm going to press M, and then I get to pick which layer I want this cone to be on. Now you can see that it's already on the first layer, and that's shown by this being a dark gray. I'm going to click the second layer. And now I'm going to do the same thing with my other cones. I'm going to select the cone, press M, move it to layer 2, select the cone, press M, and move it to layer 2. Now, how come everything's disappearing when I move it? The reason is that there are only one layer selected, or there is only one layer selected. And this layer no longer contains the cones. So when the cones move from this layer to a new layer, I can no longer see them. To be able to see the cones again, I simply select the layer that has the cones on it. One thing you'll notice about these layers is that they're not numbered. And it may be tough to remember which layers have meshes on them and which ones don't. I'm probably not going to use all 20 layers. So notice that the layers that have something in them have little circles. This circle is yellow just because I currently have a cone selected. So it's showing me that my current selection is on the second layer. And this gray circle shows me that there are objects on the first layer. I'm just not using any of them. So we always want to keep track of which layers have stuff in them and which layers we can forget about because there's nothing there. So I have my cone layer. Layer number 2 is my cone layer. If I switch back to layer number 1, I can see that I have all of my old objects in this scene, and whenever I'm ready to work with my cones, I can switch to layer. So I'm going to move this cone around. And don't worry about how we're doing this yet. I'm just going to right-click it and drag it. We're going to learn about better ways to move objects around later. But for right now, I'm going to right-click, drag it to where I want, and then I'm going to left-click to set it down. So right-click, drag, left-click. Again, we're going to learn about better tools to move cones and meshes around later. But for right now, for this example, you can move stuff by clicking with left-click, dragging, and then setting it down with left click. So right click to select, move it around, set it back down. Now remember, this is going to be backwards if you've set up your inputs like we did in the previous video. So you may find that right clicking isn't working. That probably means that your Blender is set up to left click. But one of those clicks should do the job. So keep playing around with the two different types of clicks until you get it right. If you need to change your input settings, remember to go back and check our video on the Blender interface. Great. So now, if I go back to the first layer, I can't see the changes that I've made. So how am I going to get all of the items back together so that I can see them? Well, luckily, I don't have to keep moving stuff from layer to layer. I'm going to zoom in here again, down at the bottom. If I hold Shift and then click the second layer, you can see that both of these layers are now highlighted. What that means is both of these layers are now visible. Even though my objects are on separate layers, my both layers are being displayed. So you can see that now my cones show up, and they are kind of, this one's in the middle of a sphere, this one's kind of connected to a sphere, this one's touching my circle. So we can see what the whole scene would look like when all the layers are put together. But if we want to just work in one layer, all we have to do is click it. The last thing that I want to show you with layers is that we are able to move any object to a layer, not just meshes. So let's say I want my camera to be on its own layer. I probably wouldn't do this in reality because I want to be able to know where my camera's at. But let's say I wanted my camera to be by itself. So same thing, I can select my camera, I can use the shortcut M for move, and move that camera to, let's say, layer 3. So now, if I go to layer 3, my camera is the only thing showing up. Layer 1 has most of my shapes, layer 2 has my cones. And if I want to see the whole thing together, then I can hold Shift and click all 3. If we take a quick peek at the bottom here, we can see that all 3 layers are selected, and all of the objects are back in my scene. Excuse me. So layers are very useful for working with separate pieces and for keeping our work focused. Now I am going to save my work because that's always important. I'm going to use Control S, and I'm going to change my Blender file to be called layers_example. Remember, no spaces in our file names. So layers_example, save Blender file. And now we've got an example that uses several layers with several different shapes. So hopefully you can have some fun with creating some shapes, adding them to the scene, and then seeing how layers can be used to separate everything out. Don't forget that if you're confused about any of the vocabulary or if you want some screenshots about what I did here, make sure to check out the PowerPoint.